On this episode of the Commute podcast, we talked to Larry Gigerich with Genovis. Larry is an economic development professional. He has his own company and he works in Indianapolis, and he's been working in Indianapolis for a long time. And this is my hometown. This is where I grew up. So some of the things that we talk about are, the downtown mall that I went to in high school, or the public transit stop that was closest to my home. But I personally grew up in an area that didn't have access to public transit. But you can see that the city of Indianapolis is making huge progress in getting companies to start offering commuter benefits. And Larry has been really instrumental in the work that's being done in Indianapolis to get really large companies. There are companies in Indianapolis like Salesforce, like Eli Lilly, like Rolls-Royce, that have very large workforces that range from very high paid executives to entry level workers in a manufacturing facility. And that spectrum of socioeconomics creates a huge need and opportunity for transportation. And economic development professionals are at the very earliest stage of being able to identify the problem or the opportunity for mobility. So Larry has some really interesting ideas, and he's done some interesting things with his firm to help get companies to embrace mobility. Economic development holds the keys to unlocking mobility in a city. When share mobility goes into a new town, economic development is the first group that we want to talk to, because they know the employers, they know who's hiring, who's struggling to fill all their open positions, and who's coming into town. If we can get more employers, when they're starting a new operation in the city, to say, we are going to do commuter benefits from the jump, then every new employee that's going to work there will, from day one, have options that include something other than figure it out on your own. So this conversation is great. Really love talking about my hometown, Indy, with Larry. And you'll see he cares a whole lot about this. And while he spends his days kind of working on economic development and impacting Indianapolis, he's actually thinking a lot about transportation. So it's a really cool conversation. Check it out. Here's one for the broken road. That's the only one, you better run out, truth or dare. Get me out, take me anywhere but here. I really never understood until I started sharing mobility how important an economic development department was to the fabric of a city. And in going to new markets, I continue to run into economic development professionals that are seeing problems and opportunities related to mobility at the earliest of stages. And they have become really important catalysts for making mobility happen because it's something very new. Companies haven't done it before. They haven't thought about it before. And ultimately, the reason why companies should be thinking about mobility is because there's an economic benefit for themselves and for their people. So today, I'm really excited to be joined by Larry Gigerich from Indianapolis, and he's going to talk to us about economic development, some of the projects that he's worked on, some of the things he's seeing in mobility, and how economic development is a major player in making new forms of mobility happen in our cities. So Larry, welcome to the podcast.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. It's great to be with you today.
So you're from my hometown. I grew up in Indianapolis. I love that city. And every time I go back, I see how many great things are being done. Downtown Indianapolis is killer. You've always had a great downtown, Circle Center Mall. Indigo, the bus system, has always been, a major part of the fabric of the city. I grew up out on the west side in Avon. And so I remember the Indigo bus kind of stopping somewhere around Raceway Road. Tell us a little bit about your background, what types of things, how you got to Indianapolis, and how you got into economic development.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I appreciate it. So after college, I had an opportunity to come to Indianapolis. I graduated from Indiana University in Bloomington, came to Indianapolis, wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do, but I had a really great opportunity to go to work for the state of Indiana's economic development agency. And I knew I was interested in lots of different things that impacted communities, and in particular, things that would help grow the economy as a political science and economics major in college. So it was a great opportunity to go to work there and start my career at the state. Loved it, got to work on a lot of really big things at a really young age, things that were much bigger than you'd ever talk about in class in college. and had an opportunity then to go to work for a 5 years after that for a new mayor of Indianapolis, Steve Goldsmith, who came in with a real vision for transforming Indianapolis, both in terms of how government functioned and operated, but also economic development, really taking a fresh look at it. And I love that opportunity. Did that for a number of years before starting my firm, Genovis.
That's great. What a great background. And I remember Mayor Goldsmith. What were some of the major projects in Indianapolis that his administration implemented?
Worked on a number of different things. Certainly, kind of a couple of the higher profile things. One was certainly building Bankers Life Fieldhouse for the Indiana Pacers. Back then, it was Conseco Fieldhouse. Building that new arena, which was a significant part of downtown redevelopment. And then we also constructed Circle Center Mall. It was a project that had been talked about in Indianapolis for close to 10 years. When Mayor Goldsmith took office, there were a number of holes in downtown Indianapolis that had been dug out in preparation for a mall to be built, but nothing had moved forward. And then the other big thing we did is we targeted 7 low-income neighborhoods in Indianapolis and had a program called Building Better Neighborhoods, where we concentrated money from several different departments, including our Department of Transportation, to go in and really help spur economic development, things around talent, real estate redevelopment, infrastructure, things like that. And that for me was one of the things I'm probably the most proud of, is the impact we had on 7 low-income neighborhoods in Indianapolis. And looking back now, close to 20 years ago, to see where those neighborhoods are today, doing much, much better.
Are those things like Mass Ave and some of the Near East Side neighborhoods that have really started to develop?
Yeah, so Mass Ave, to the east of downtown, an area where Angie's List was founded, and a lot of redevelopment that went out East Washington Street, which has just continued now for miles and miles. And then we also did work to really link just west of downtown Indianapolis on the west side of the White River to the rest of downtown, a neighborhood called Hawville that had gone through a lot of transition, and worked closely with that area and did some really good things over there as well.
That's great. Well, I want to come back to the neighborhoods and talent piece, but for somebody that's not familiar with economic development, how would you define it?
Yeah, and one of the things I love about economic development is the fact that it impacts so many different things in a community, a region, a state, whatever it might be. And when you look at it, really is, at least in my mind, as I narrow it down, economic development is about attracting investments and creating and retaining jobs in your community. And then what that all means for the people that live and work in that area, meaning, let's say you have a company come into an area and say, we're going to invest $5 million and hire 100 people. Well, that $5 million is going to generate new property taxes, which helps pay for education, police and fire protection, kind of some of the basic things that we all depend on in life. And then the people working and the taxes associated with the wages that they earn also go to fund some of those things in the community. Plus, it really creates a lot of momentum for others to follow and make investments and hire people. So really, in my mind, economic development is all about helping to grow and create wealth in the community so everyone who lives there is better off as time moves forward.
I think that's a very clear and easy to understand explanation of what economic development is. And so if you like things that are happening in your city, you have economic development very much to thank. So as you're going into these communities that are challenged, I could imagine that those who are lacking historical wealth are the ones who have often a very big transportation need, and there's a huge opportunity to uplift them. So I'm sure things have changed a lot in the last 20 years, but when it came to transportation, when you first started into these neighborhoods, what were the types of problems you were seeing, and how does that contrast to what problems are like now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great question. So a couple things I would point to. Certainly a disconnect that existed then, and to a certain extent still exists today, is getting people from those areas of neighborhoods of a city where you have higher unemployment, getting them to job centers in a metropolitan area. that mobility issue has always been a challenge, not just for where I live in Indianapolis, but across the country. That's a challenge, getting people to where the jobs are from neighborhoods where you have high unemployment. The other one is more kind of a basic, life issue day to day for people. Those same areas that have higher unemployment, typically lower income, also are not close to retail services, in particular groceries. You have these food deserts that exist in so many different areas where people rely on transportation to get to the grocery store, to get to the pharmacy. They don't have the ability to walk to one in their neighborhood. And that is another challenge. So I think headway has been made, not only again in Indianapolis, but across the country over the last 20 years, but there are still challenges that exist there today on those two fronts.
So do you bring the jobs to the people, or do you bring the people to the jobs?
I think it's a combination, actually, and it's easier said than done, certainly. But I think you need to take really important steps in economic development with community leaders, the private sector, elected officials, to identify opportunities to create jobs and spur redevelopment in neighborhoods that are more challenged economically. At the same time, because that will take time to happen, that's not a 1 to 2 year proposition. That's a 5 to 10 year proposition to really transform an area. You have to, in the interim, get people from those areas to where the jobs are today. And that's for two reasons. One, to help those people, obviously, with employment and economic opportunities. But secondly, you have to meet the need. I don't care what community, region, state you are, you have to meet the talent need for the businesses that are in your area in order to be successful economically. So getting people to those jobs that are available today are critically important. So it's really a combination of both if you want to have that long-term success.
And that's often why economic development is hearing about these transportation needs early, because you are listening to companies and they're telling you what they're going to need in regards to talent, both proactively, right, when you're attracting investment, but also from the job retention perspective, right, trying to keep an organization like Rolls-Royce or Eli Lilly to keep growing their jobs and keep everything there locally. So talent is so important in economic development. There's a new trend or topic around 15-minute cities, and 15-minute cities very much require an abundance of transportation options that allow you to get around your city. Is that something that you see developing in, a middle market city like Indianapolis or like a Columbus?
Yeah, no question that has become very important. And you think about, to a certain extent too. So Indigo, that's the public transportation provider in the Indianapolis area. They like so many different communities, regions across the country are dependent on federal funding. Well, that federal funding has a lot of constraints built in what they can do in that flexibility. So as a result of that, they can only serve certain areas and implement different technologies, whether it's, rapid bus service or other things that have happened here in Indianapolis to try to improve. But at the same time, again, because of those constraints, you have to look at alternative mobility solutions and, kind of what I've always described as on demand mobility. How do you get people not only to and from work, but to and from the services that they need in the community? And to your point, with the 15-minute cities being in a position where people can access jobs, access the services that they need, whether that's, medical, dental, whatever it may be, within a 15-minute period of time, something that's close, good access, and it's really going to take a combination of those creative private sector solutions working in partnership with the public sector.
Federal funding is limited, right? And what coronavirus has shown us is that if it's tied to tax revenue, it can often go away and can be really limited and can be a constraint. I think it's essential that more private sector investment comes into mobility. And economic development for us at Share Mobility has often been a catalyst in connecting with businesses that have a need, have a problem, getting to the right decision maker and helping them understand that there's a financial benefit to starting to offer commuter benefits. But it's not something historically employers have been involved with, right? they're not conditioned to think about spending money on transportation for employees. So
Oh,
when
absolutely. Yeah. No, to your point, Ryan, you do not see that as something historically that has happened with employers in particular. I mean, the long-standing view has been, and until recently, with some really thoughtful companies taking some leadership roles in this area, it's been, hey, we're gonna take care of providing the real estate. We're gonna pay people. We're gonna do those types of things, but we're gonna leave it to them to figure out how they get to work, and whether that's their own vehicle, public transportation, or again, some creative on-demand solution that's there. So I think it's going to be really important, to your point, not only for economic development, but just for how communities and regions function, that we see the private sector become more involved, not only with funding, but also just more involved in the voice and the public policy development around it as well.
if you were to put the adoption of commuter benefits from employers onto a spectrum or a range, and if it's 0 on one end, they don't care, they haven't thought about it, 10, everybody's offering commuter benefits, where do you think we are in that adoption cycle of getting ubiquitous commuter benefits in employers?
Yeah, I think we're still pretty early. So I would say, that's probably right now we're in that 2 to 3 on that scale of 10 that you
Yeah.
described.
Yeah.
Certainly because there's been more cost pressures, and for that matter, regulatory and tax issues in some of your very large cities and metropolitan areas across the country. That has caused or forced some action to take place. In other areas across the country, especially middle market cities, it's just now starting to emerge, and that's being more driven by kind of that young, well-educated talent that is not always going to be inclined to own their own car. They're thinking about sustainability and environmental issues more top of mind, but those areas also don't suffer from the same level of congestion or the same, kind of tax or regulatory burden. So long answer to your question, but I would say we're kind of in that 2 to 3 range right now, but I do see a lot of acceleration as I look over the last 18 to 24 months. And I think COVID will be an interesting twist too, as it impacts public transportation as we go forward, when we face a future pandemic, which is probably more likely than not down the road.
I think you're pretty optimistic about where we're at, Larry. Um,
Yeah.
I think it's very, very early days as far as getting companies to do something about this. 2017 was when I first started talking to companies about mobility. You've been doing it a lot longer, right? Are you seeing an acceleration in the acceptance so that it might have taken 5 years to get companies to hear, but the next 5 years will make 10 times as progress? Do you think we're accelerating?
I do think we're accelerating, and we've been fortunate, I think, to have some thoughtful companies. Certainly in the tech sector, not surprisingly, they embrace this concept probably earlier and faster than a lot of other industry sectors, without a doubt. And that's
Yep.
partly just because of their leadership, and it's partly because the type of talent that they're trying to attract, without a doubt. I think that the trend we have seen in particular in the last 12 to 18 months has been looking at more traditional, let's call it office users for purposes of this discussion, financial services companies, insurance companies, other large office users that have said, hey, we recognize there's an issue. We need to do something to be part of the solution. We also know from a talent perspective, it's going to be important. And then I think, as we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years in many places, downtowns in particular have a rebirth or a revival.
Yep.
Things like parking and other issues have become really critical in downtown areas, and parking is not as available as it used to be, and it's
Mhm.
certainly not as inexpensive as it used to be in those downtown areas. So the employers are also saying, hey, we need to help our team members address these issues and be part of that solution.
Well, and I hope as companies are proposing their new building projects, they're looking out 20, 30 years and they're seeing the value of parking diminishing. And they're saying they don't want to make investments in that. That's going to force a reduction in parking availability, but it's very much forecasted about where things are going. You can take an approach of a carrot or a stick with some of these economic incentives. And I think commuter benefits ordinances are something that could be considered and could really be driven through economic development. Are you familiar with this idea of a commuter benefits ordinance? It's pretty new.
Yeah, I've heard a little bit about it, but certainly not well versed.
Yeah, I mean, it's generally the idea that a city or a community is going to mandate that employers make it easy to buy bus passes pre-tax. Maybe it's carpooling. It's definitely parking reduction, and it's absolutely single occupancy vehicle reduction. I think that's a big catalyst. It's a heavy hand to get all of that done. If we can just show employers the ROI behind doing this, they're going to have less turnover. They're going to be able to save significantly, and their employees will have huge savings. You had talked early on about how economic development advocates for job creation because of the trickle-down effect of taxes. With single occupancy vehicle reduction, or every mile you drive, you pay 55 cents or so, right? That's the average IRS. Well, it costs your city infrastructure something like 50 cents in real costs and environmental costs, right? Not really easy to measure costs, but call it 50 cents a mile, right? Do you think there's an appetite in cities for recognizing the economic benefit of the single occupancy vehicle reduction and actually turning it into some type of credit where companies or operators or transit agencies would actually get some financial benefit from accomplishing that vehicle elimination?
Yeah, and to your point earlier, Ryan, I think it's important to look at both kind of the carrot and the stick part of it because obviously, more often than not, especially employers react better to a carrot than a stick in a lot of ways. And
Yep.
I think there's a lot of interesting things that are underway in different cities across the country. And, just thinking about kind of the Midwest, middle market areas, one of the things Indianapolis did was to launch a pilot program earlier this year to say to companies, hey, if you work with us on some of these issues around mobility, both to help us with parking issues and congestion in our downtown area, but obviously with an eye towards infrastructure maintenance when they already have more roads that they need to maintain than they have funding for. And as you said, in this COVID environment, those constraints have become a heavier lift for them too. That they have started to do that as a test. And I think we've seen some of our clients respond very favorably towards that. And again, recognizing that you need to look down the road and see what things are coming. And obviously that's going to involve, we all believe, I think, less cars, less parking. So just a real quick story. I had an opportunity to be a part of the team that worked with Amazon on the HQ2 project on behalf of Indianapolis. Our firm was one of two lead firms that put together the initial proposal and then the second proposal when Indianapolis was named as one of the 20 finalists, along with several other cities, including Columbus and Nashville and others. And it was interesting when the Amazon people came in to take their visit with their team to Indianapolis. They made that very point about, look what's 20 or 30 years down the road. Don't just look at today and what our needs are and kind of what that static view looks like. And, and by the way, we're going to give you, credits or points, so to speak, in our evaluation process if you have some creative solutions to that issue. So it's a very long way of saying that certainly Amazon is a very kind of thoughtful, leading edge thinker on many things that impact public policy. But the point is, that was a great rallying cry in Indianapolis for the public sector and the private sector to come together and say, okay, we need to do some things differently. We know we have all these pressures going on. So let's experiment with a lot of different things around on-demand mobility, this pilot grant to reward companies that are doing creative things around mobility to reduce car usage, help us with our parking challenges. So I think testing and trying out a lot of different potential mobility solutions will pay great dividends, and we'll look back 3 to 5 years from now and say, wow, what happened in that past time period really led us to innovate and come up with some unique things. There's going to be a lot of trial and error, and some things are going to work, some aren't, but that's okay. That's part of getting to the right place.
So you're actually, or the city of Indianapolis is actually offering grants for employers to offer mobility programs. Is that correct?
They are. So what they did was take part of their tax increment financing dollars for their downtown TIF district that has been very successful because of all the development that has taken place, and said we're going to provide grants of $10,000 to $20,000 per company, and not a huge number of companies. Look at maybe 10 to 12 companies, try it, and then measure it in the next 18 to 24 months, kind of find the results, and then go back and refine it. And then hopefully, depending on funding availability, maybe look at doing something on a broader scale. And again, not surprisingly, your largest employers and then some fast growing tech companies have been the ones to say, yeah, we'd love to participate in this. We're going to put money into it. The city provides a grant, and trying different solutions now.
Well, companies like Salesforce have already landed in Indianapolis, and there's a lot of talk about how more and more tech companies are going to be opening up facilities in the Midwest and in cities like Indianapolis. So what, if you were giving advice to another city that wanted to do a grant program like this, or wanted to do something to spur employers, how do you get this started? Who needs to be at the table? Do you have any advice?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it's important to bring together for government and whatever vehicle that they use or agency they use for transportation and mobility issues, to bring a really diverse group of private sector people around the table together. But I also think it's important to bring community development and economic development people around the table too, because they are, as I've likened it here, it's a much different kind of first responder, but they've been another important first responder as we try to rebuild our economy, coming out of COVID because of that economic impact. So, certainly having your large employers at the table that, just by sheer numbers have more people that
Mm-hmm.
have to get around, have to get to work. That obviously is an important voice. It's also an important voice to look at, some of your smaller, fast-growing companies that maybe are really focused on that super well-educated young talent base that, again, like my 3 kids in college, look at things a little bit differently, what's important to them and how that will shape things as that group of people are larger and larger in our workforce. And then again, the other part of it being also looking for those companies that are also known for trying different things. I mean, whether it's Indianapolis, Columbus, Nashville, Minneapolis, there's lots of companies that try creative things to address lots of different issues, whether it's talent or anything else, and how you harness that and put it to work for something like this, I think is really important. And finally, the last thing I would say too is look at in your communities those large endowments or foundations that are really focused on community development, economic development, quality of place issues. And, in every community, even, smaller metropolitan areas have those kinds of entities in their communities who may come to the table with some dollars too, but also have some interesting ideas to share.
It takes a lot of stakeholders. It's going to require a lot of different funding sources. Once you get all those stakeholders in the room, how do you get the employers to really understand the value? Other than take the dollars out of it, right? Dollars might attract somebody, but if they really critically think about this, the 15,000 or 20 or 100,000 you gave them is going to pale in comparison to the long-term costs if they don't see an ROI in doing these mobility programs. So what is the thing you say to them to make them want to apply?
Yeah, and I think it's, whether it's this issue, of mobility, whether it's environmental or green initiatives. I think at the end of the day, and to your point, Ryan, it's not about government giving them money to do things. It's really quantifying
Yeah.
cost savings that are going to arise as a result of doing this. I mean, when you can sit down with a company and say, okay, right now you're subsidizing parking for the 500 people you have working in your office space in downtown Indianapolis. Think about if now your 500 employees only needed 250 parking spaces, and what that monthly subsidy you're providing would be if you cut that in half. Again, quantifying that value. I think there's that piece of it. And then I think the other part of it is just indicating too the positive impact it has on the business climate, in particular the tax climate of an area. Because if you are not creating as much wear and tear, so to speak, on your infrastructure system by having these creative mobility solutions, that in the end of the day is going to help save dollars at a time when every dollar for a local unit of government is more precious in the world we live in today. So I think again, it's showing them, hey, there's a financial reason, a savings reason, not that we're going to hand you money. It's you're going to save money, and at the same time, here's how it's going to help the community overall. I think that's a pretty compelling message, for companies that are thoughtful in how they look at it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For a city like Indianapolis, where you have so many diverse industries, a lot of times the companies are just competing with each other over talent. But mobility, I don't believe, is something that a company should look at as a competitive advantage. It's something that they need to be doing and then bringing other employers into it because it has a network effect. This won't happen if one employer wants to keep the light under the bushel basket. They don't want anybody to know about how great this mobility thing is because they want to get all the employees. It has to be something where people feel like there's a duty to referring and bringing other organizations into this. Do you ever run into that where companies like, hey, I want to do this, but I don't want anybody else to do it?
Yeah, that comes up sometimes, but I would say this. I mean, just kind of looking at the last 3 to 5 years, and I think as we look going forward too, more and more companies have become enlightened, and this term that we've used with a number of our clients, which is co-opetition, whether it's been talent, whether it's been creative solutions to identify issues, whether it's, the cost of benefits, whether it's mobility, whether it's real estate, whatever it is, to demonstrate that sharing best in class ideas with people that, yes, you may compete for talent on some occasions, but if it improves the efficiency and the outcomes for the businesses in this community, in this region, that's a good thing for everybody. I think more and more people are embracing that. And then the kind of the final part that I would note too is, again, using Indianapolis as an example, they've put together a group of about 40 major employers, and they've called it Indifluence. And it's around a lot of talent related things to get more young, well-educated, talented people to look at the Indy region and all the opportunities that are here. But they've also then taken that platform and built on it to figure out how they come together as a really powerful group of employers to impact public policy in different areas. So now they're talking about, infrastructure and mobility issues. They're talking about talent issues. They're talking about creative quality of place investments that they can partner with foundations in the public sector to do, again, to make the area even much more attractive to people who live and work here. And I think those discussions will only grow as we go forward.
Well, you said it earlier about Amazon, right? Amazon's forward thinking. They've followed on. They do the Google bus thing just like Google does. But they made transportation part of the RFI they did. They told cities, if you want to win, you've got to have mobility as part of the solution. And based on the ones they picked, they were all cities that had high-speed rail. Now, if we can get the stakeholders together and we can get the transit agencies to maybe be the champions for this, you could accomplish everything that high-speed rail does through data, multimodal mobility, and it just requires a unified thought and presentation. But companies, as they're thinking about where they go next and where they grow next, transportation needs to be, and I think is, one of those questions that they're asking. They always ask the employee, do you have reliable transportation? And it's a standard job application question. If you say no, you're not getting that job. Now, maybe by 2030, every employer is saying, this is how you will get to work, or options of how you get to work. And then if that doesn't work, then we'll get the stick out. And do you see commute times as a factor in growth for cities? Like if commute times keep increasing, will that diminish the growth of a city like Indianapolis?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question, and we see this. I mean, not just again with your forward-thinking tech companies that we do work with, but companies across the board. That's an important question, and it's typically asked in one of a couple ways. I mean, it could be just directly, "Hey, commute times in your area. What do those look, or in the different areas we're considering?" As we help them identify those markets, or it could be, "Okay, within a 50-mile radius, what's our labor catchment area?" And then that translates directly into how quickly people, how much distance they can cover and how long it takes that for that 50 miles, right? So that's becoming a more and more important of a question. And certainly as those commute times increase, that is a red flag or concern for our clients in the site selection process. And so again, I think having even those places today, and a lot of places in the Midwest, I mean, setting aside a place like Chicago, obviously, but a lot of places in the Midwest, you can get around pretty easily. Your commute times aren't terrible, and it's kind of all relative to what you're used to experiencing. Well, even in those situations, it's an important factor. And if you see those commuting times, every year increasing by a couple minutes, and suddenly it doesn't look as easy to get around as possible, then that's impactful. So you're better to stay ahead of that versus to find yourself in a real bad situation from an economic development perspective, trying to fix something that frankly has gotten out of control, using and I've got a lot of friends down there, using Austin, Texas as an example. I mean, Austin is an absolute mess, and a lot of our, from an infrastructure standpoint, a lot of our clients are saying, "Hey, we're not sure we want to go down and put something in that market today because of how much congestion there is and how hard it is for people to move around, to get to and from work."
One of the reasons why I pick cities like Indianapolis over going to cities like Los Angeles with our microtransit and mobility as a service. My vehicle is sitting in traffic, no matter how full it is, it's going to cost me more to operate that ride than if I can plan around traffic in a city like Indianapolis. I also think that there's more of an uplift that we can get in a middle market city where we can be working with public transit. You mentioned the site selection process, and for so many employers, they didn't think about transportation when they made site selection, and then they show up at the transit agency and they say, "What are you going to do for me now?" Is it economic professionals, economic development professionals like you that are telling them to think about mobility early on?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, it's important for us early in the process to identify the key assumptions and criteria to make a decision. But one of our most important jobs is to say to our clients, "Okay, here are things you really need to consider and really look at." And, mobility and talent are two of the most important things we bring up. We also talk about just kind of the overall stability of a marketplace with their tax and regulatory climate rather. But without a doubt, mobility is an early part of our conversation. Say you really need to understand what the market looks like, and to be able to have us weight that factor appropriately to make sure you make the best decision. Because in the day, I mean, we always like to joke with our team, if we do our job right, and a company has a great outcome as a result of the site selection project we worked on, then we've made a few people inside that organization look like heroes. If it goes sideways a few years down the road, they're going to point back to us as the people they brought in to advise them. So it's important for us to identify all those things on the front end and say to them, "Hey, you need to really weigh these things." And in particular, we're going to give them higher weight because the long-term impact it could have on your success in that market.
Well, I really appreciate you, Larry, coming here today and telling us and sharing some of the experiences you've had, educating us on economic development and the role for mobility. I think it's going to take a lot of professionals like you working across the country to get more companies to that state of enlightenment, especially in regards to mobility. And maybe there's something there in an open source playbook, right? Where all of these ideas around how commuter benefits and mobility programs actually work will eventually start getting together into a open playbook that's not part of a proprietary company or product. It's part of a common knowledge base, and using that knowledge base to uplift more and more cities. Because if you're going to help a city like Muncie with mobility, they don't have the economic development resources that you have, but I can guarantee you they have employers or something around the university that is an acute mobility problem. they could be picking up your playbook. Maybe some of them will hear this and get some ideas, because I don't think it takes a big city or a medium-sized city. It could be a very, very small community that decides to champion mobility and do something about it. And even helping a neighborhood get better commuter options can make a really, really huge impact. And if we make progress today, 100 years from now, transportation really will be equal, fair, and this hope of equitable access will actually be accomplished. So, Larry, I'm very happy you're doing the work you're doing in the world, and I think one of the great win is in helping people get equitable access to the jobs that will ultimately really help improve their life.
Well, I appreciate that, and you guys are doing outstanding work as well. And if we all focus our energy and efforts together and convince enough public policy and company leaders, which I think we can, uh, the opportunities are endless. And I think that's what I'm most excited about when I look at this issue.
Well, if all we've got to do is get our officials on board, I feel really good about that, because the ones that I talk to recognize there's a problem and want to do something about it. So I don't think that's going to hold us back. Larry, thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks, Ryan. I really appreciate the opportunity.